Hi, I'm Joseph Feraldi. I want to thank you for joining us here at Bayside Chapel online. Our prayer is that today's service will be a blessing to you, that will encourage you in your journey with Jesus Christ, and it will help you to see all that God has in store for you. We would love to hear from you on how God is using this ministry to bless you, and we'd love the opportunity to pray for you. Just send us an email at amen@baysidechapel.org. Remember that you can stay in touch with us at any time. Just visit the App Store and search for our app at Bayside Chapel of NJ. Also, if God is using this ministry to bless you, we'd like to give you the opportunity to partner with us financially. Simply go online to baysidechapel.org or use the Bayside Chapel app and choose whatever option works best for you. Enjoy today's message.
Some of the most revealing times of our lives are those times when everything seems to be going wrong. It seems that when life is dealing us some of its cruelest blows, that people can see us for who we really are. There was a time when I was an assistant pastor years ago in Michigan, in my mid-20s, and I got a phone call at home that evening. It was the pastor's wife who was saying that she'd received a phone call from one of the families of the church and they needed the pastor to come over right away. They'd suffered a tragedy, but the pastor was out of town, and she said, "Can you go instead?" And so, of course, I went, and as I was driving over to the home of Len and Margaret Hamminga, I was thinking, what am I going to say to this couple? They were a couple in their mid-60s, newly retired, enjoying life, and that evening they had learned that their son had died at work, electrocuted in a horrible accident. And so I'm like 27 years old or so, 25 years old, going over to their home, wondering, what am I going to say to this couple? And the Lord kind of said, don't say anything at all. Just go be with them and pray with them. And I arrived at the front door and rang the doorbell. Margaret opened it, and we exchanged big hugs. And then I went in and I found Len and gave him a hug. I'd known these folks for maybe 2 or 3 years, mostly through, chit-chat before and after worship services on Sunday. But in that next hour, I got to know more about Len and Margaret Hamminga than I had ever known of them in the previous 2 to 3 years. I got to see them as they really were. I saw them in their anguish, their tremendous grief, but I also saw great faith, and confidence and trust in the Lord in the midst of their tragic circumstances. And the room began to fill up with friends and family who were rushing over to be with them in their loss. And we just kind of sat together, and it was really an incredible thing to see their faith shining through in the midst of it all. I learned more about them in that 1 hour than I had in the 2 previous years. It's when we're going through life's most intense adversity that people are most likely to see us as we really are. We're starting a new 4-part series today in the book of Job. We're calling it When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And for the graphic, Nick has this hurricane thing going on because there's been a lot of bad stuff going on in the world lately, hasn't there? All these hurricanes, and we see people suffering in various places all around the United States and out in the Caribbean. Puerto Rico has been ravaged, and it's horrible to see what's going on there. And not only is it bad stuff in the news between hurricanes and earthquakes, but also right here within our own church family, it seems like this has been a really hard season for a lot of our families, going through really, really tough stuff. Losing loved ones, experiencing major health challenges. And so it just seemed appropriate that we get into the book of Job for a little while this October, for these 4 weeks of October, and ask that question, what's going on when bad things happen to good people? Christian pollster George Barna once did a poll in which he asked, if you could ask God one question knowing that he would answer you, what's the one question you would want to ask God? And the most frequent response was, people wanted to ask the question, why is there pain and suffering in the world? In fact, it said that one issue it contributes to unbelief more than any other, that God would allow pain and suffering in the world. Well, Job is the book of the Bible that speaks most directly to that question of why God allows bad things to happen to us. And so we're going to walk for these next 4 weeks with this good man, Job, to whom some horrible, horrible things happened. And we'll watch him struggle to make sense of it all. We'll learn what not to say to hurting people. We'll learn something about where is God to be found when life is beating us up. Because it's hard, isn't it, to understand why bad things happen to good people, why a young dad has to lose his life in a car accident, or why a devoted mom has to go through a bout with cancer, why loving parents have to lose a child to a drug overdose. In Job, as in life, we find a whole lot of people asking, why are these bad things happening? Well, God waits to show them something that actually makes the why question quite irrelevant. Now, in order to benefit from this book's teaching, we need to travel with Job through some of the worst that life could ever throw at a person. So I'm going to invite you to put yourself in Job's shoes this morning. We're about to find out what kind of stuff he's made of in these first 2 chapters of the book. In fact, the big lesson of these first 2 chapters is simply that adversity reveals who we really are. Adversity reveals who we really are. When bad things happen to good people, you learn a lot about them. We're introduced to Job in the beginning of chapter 1, but we don't really know who Job is until after he's been put to the test. Now, who's this guy, Job? Well, right off the bat, we learn that he's a godly man. It says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Not that he was a perfect man, but he was a godly man, one who sought after God. Not only was he a godly man, but he was a family man. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He was abundantly blessed with children. He was a wealthy man, we learn in verse 3. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. It's not just that he was a wealthy man, he was the wealthiest guy around. So a godly man, a family man, a wealthy man, and a devoted dad. We learn about that in verse 4, where it says, his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. This was the one thing that Job really feared. He says, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. In case any of his children sinned, in case they had cursed God in their hearts, Job was continually offering sacrifices on their behalf to atone for them. He was a devoted dad. So far, so good. A godly man, a family man, a wealthy man, a devoted dad. But look what happens next. In verse 6, it says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. Sounds very innocent, doesn't it? But we know better. The Apostle Peter in 1 Peter 3:8 kind of alludes to this going to and fro of Satan. And he says there, be sober-minded and watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. God knows that Satan's going to and fro upon the earth isn't just innocent activity. He's always prowling around looking to take someone down. And God asks Satan if he's had a go at Job yet, knowing that Job would present quite a challenge to the evil one. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns from evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. See what Satan's saying there? He's saying that Job's devotion to God, that Job's godliness is artificial. He's bought and paid for. Job only serves God because it pays so well. God has blessed him like nobody else, and he's put a hedge around him so that nothing bad can happen to him. Who wouldn't love God under such circumstances? You take his blessings away, and Job will curse you to your face. He'll only be devoted to you as long as you're blessing him, God. Satan's implying that no one really loves God for God's own sake. That we only love God for what we can get out of him. That the worship we offer is only to manipulate him so that he'll give us more of his blessings, more stuff. He's saying to God, Men are all phonies. You're a fool, God, to think that they really love you for who you really are. Their supposed worship of you is basically selfish. And Job is like all the rest. Take away all the things that you blessed him with, and he will curse you like anyone else. So God gives permission to Satan to try to break Job, but with a limitation. Verse 12, and the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. It's interesting that God gives Satan permission to do this at all. Doesn't God already know the devotion of Job, the genuineness of his worship? Yes, he does. In fact, he seems so confident of Job's devotion that he's not afraid to let Job be tested to prove Satan wrong. In addition, Job may be genuinely devout, but he's largely untested. He's unproven at this point. And God knows how much stronger he will be for having gone through the fire of adversity. Something else that's important to note here is that Satan has no power except what God permits him to have. Satan is not some mighty sovereign over a rival kingdom. He is nowhere near God's equal. He is a fallen rebel whose powers are wholly subject to God's limitations. He's a pathetic creature who spends what little power he has trying to gain some advantage over God, and it always backfires on him. The tables always get turned on him. And the best example of that is the cross. You know, when he's going at Jesus and trying to tempt Judas and get everybody to turn against Jesus so that he'll be nailed to that cross, and he thinks he's won, he's just secured his defeat. Because God is going to use that to bring about the greatest possible good, the salvation of mankind. What a magnificent God we serve, so sovereignly in control that he can allow the prince of darkness to have his way and still emerge the unquestioned victor. The beauty of it all here in Job 1 is that God orchestrates all of the variables in such a way, including Satan's attacks. He orchestrates all the variables in such a way as to ensure that he receives glory, and it turns out for Job's good. As the old hymn puts it, and though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. And the Lord says to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And Satan goes on the attack, and the devastation comes from 4 directions at the same time. Verse 13, now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid of the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine at their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone escaped to tell you. Have you ever noticed that when bad news strikes, it seems to break upon you like a roaring ocean, wave upon wave? Tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy breaks upon Job's soul in unrelenting succession, and it's dawning on him in this moment that he has lost everything he owns. And worst of all, he suffered the loss of his beloved children. What's the first thing you would do under such circumstances? One's first response to tragedy speaks volumes about a person. Look what Job does. Verse 20, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head. These are both signs of intense grief. Tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshiped. here's where we get a good look at the stuff Job is really made of. We don't see here the Job we were introduced to at the beginning of chapter 1, a blessed, carefree man who sings the praises of God, who has been so good to him. We see rather a man who has been stripped down to his bare essence. Everything has been taken from him that he cares about. He's grieving, too crushed in spirit to put up a false front of cheerful courage. His emotion is honest and raw. But with torn robe and shaved head, what else comes out of him? Worship. Someone has said that if you really want to know what's in a person, squeeze him. Well, Job has been mightily squeezed here, and what comes out of him is not cursing, as Satan predicted, but praise. And he said, verse 21, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this, he recognizes that the blessings he has enjoyed in life came from the Lord, and the same Lord has every right to take them away. Satan had predicted that when stripped of his blessings, Job would curse God to his face, but instead he falls on his face in worship and says, blessed be the name of the Lord. And in verse 22, the chapter ends by saying, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. He passes the test. He's not just a sunshine worshiper of God. He worships God in the ugliest of storms. It was admirable that he worshiped God when he enjoyed so many blessings, but that he worships God now shows that his worship is real. Remember we said adversity reveals who we really are? Well, here's the first way it does so. It reveals whether our worship is real. When we're being blessed and we say, isn't God good? God is good all the time. And people look at us and say, well, of course they worship God. Look how good things are for them. But when you've been through the fire and everything has been taken away from you and you still come out the other side saying, blessed be the name of the Lord, now that worship seems much more real somehow, doesn't it? Richard Stearns, the president of World Vision, visited a church in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, about a year after the great earthquake of 2010. He said the church's building consisted of a tent made of white tarps that had been duct taped together. And it was in the middle of this sprawling camp where thousands of people were still homeless from the earthquake. And he describes that worship service this way. He says, in the front row sat 6 amputees ranging from age 6 to 60. They were clapping and smiling as they sang song after song and lifted their prayers to God. The worship was full of hope and with thanksgiving to the Lord. No one was singing louder or praying more fervently than Demosi Lufine. She's the woman up at the front of the room there in the white with the red head covering. 32 years old, unemployed single mother of 2. During the earthquake, a collapsed building crushed her right arm and left leg. After 4 days, both limbs had to be amputated. She was leading the choir, leading prayers, standing on her prosthesis, lifting her one hand high in praise to God. Following the service, I met Demosi's 2 daughters, age 8 and 10. The 3 of them now live in a tent 5 feet tall and perhaps 8 feet wide. Despite losing her job, her home, and 2 limbs, she is deeply grateful to God because her life was spared on January 12th of 2010. He brought me back like Lazarus, giving me the gift of life, says Demosi, who believes she survived the devastating quake for 2 reasons, to raise her girls and to serve her Lord for a few more years. Now here's what Stearns says about his reaction to all this. He says, it makes no sense to me as an entitled American who grouses about the smallest inconvenience, a clogged drain or a slow Wi-Fi connection in my home. Yet here in this place, many people who'd lost everything expressed nothing but praise. I find my own sense of charity for people like Demosi inadequate. They have so much more to offer me than I do to them. I feel pity and sadness for them, but it is they who might better pity me for the shallowness of my own walk with Christ. What's clear about Job is that his walk with God was not shallow. Adversity revealed that his worship was real. And it will reveal whether ours is real as well. Do we worship God simply and purely for who he is? Or do we only praise him when things are going our way? One of the things that really moves me as a pastor as I come to worship, and I've heard some of our other pastors say this too, is that we know your stories. We know about a lot of the stuff you've been through, what you're going through now, the illnesses, the loss, the bereavement. And yet we watch how so many of you don't stay away in bitterness against God, but you can't wait to get here on Sunday morning to be with God's people, to seek God's face, and to lift your voice in praise to God. That kind of worship takes on a whole new depth and a genuineness compared to the worship of one who's ever only known smooth sailing. When blessings have been taken away from us, will we still say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord"? Job did. He passed the test. His worship was real. But Satan wasn't ready to concede defeat just yet. And so we go on into chapter 2 for a few verses where it says, "Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, 'From where have you come?' And Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down on it.'" Sound familiar? "And the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears the Lord and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason.'" God is saying, what did I tell you? Job is the real thing. His worship goes beyond my blessing of him. You practically destroyed him, and his integrity remains intact. His worship is real. This is not just an act. And look how Satan responds in verse 4. "Then Satan answered the Lord and said, 'Skin for a skin. All that a man has, he will give for his life.'" Do you see what Satan is saying there? He's saying, this Job guy is more selfish than I ever thought. All he cares about is himself. I mean, a guy will exchange his wealth and all of his kids, if only to spare his life. All he cares about is himself. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. Let me mess with the man's health, and then we'll see what he's really made of. We'll see how quick he turns on you. And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." Again, we see that Satan is limited to only what God will allow. Again, we see God's confidence in Job's integrity and that he will prove Satan wrong. And even though he has suffered much, there's apparently even more to be accomplished in Job's life by allowing Satan to turn up the heat. There are certain things that can only be learned about ourselves, certain things we will only ever learn about God by going through suffering. There's a certain strength of character can only be gained in the heat of adversity. The depth of our trust in God will be proven by those who've endured the worst kind of pain. Many of the strongest people that I have known in my life are those who've learned to trust God in the midst of painful, painful trials. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Again, we see the cruelty of Satan's attack in his ruthless treatment of Job. His condition is hideous, requiring him to sit outside the city gates, probably in the town garbage dump where things are burned, and so there's ashes there. He's covered with festering sores. Later in Job, it expands on his condition in various places, and we learn not only that he has these inflamed ulcerous sores, but there is itching, degenerative changes in his facial skin, loss of appetite, depression, worms in his boils, hardening skin and running sores, difficulty breathing, dark eyelids, foul breath, loss of weight, continual pain, restlessness, blackened skin, and fever, all of which may have lasted for months. And if all that isn't bad enough, Satan delivers what he hopes will be the knockout punch. And so that Job doesn't even see it coming, Satan presses Job's loving wife into service to deliver the blow. She apparently has given in to despair. She's lost her family. She has lost the comfortable life that she had known. And now she's sentenced to be caregiver to a guy in this hideous condition. She can't take it anymore. She can't keep quiet. What use is it for Job to continue his devotion to a God who has betrayed him so miserably? Why doesn't he face the fact that God has unjustly abandoned him? In her estimation, God doesn't deserve Job's loyalty anymore. And then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." Curse God and die. That was the whole challenge. He will curse you to your face. And here's his own wife telling him he should do it. Do what Satan predicted. He seems intent on taking your life anyway. I mean, you might as well get your revenge by cursing him before he does. Deny God that one thing he's always wanted from you, Job, your loyalty, your devotion, your trust. Of course, if Job curses God, it will prove that Satan was right about him. Take away his blessings and he will curse you to your face. And she's saying, go ahead, curse him, get your revenge. And if he strikes you dead, at least you'll be out of your misery and I won't have to watch you suffer anymore. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Remember the scripture says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. You're speaking foolishly. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? Should we only take the good that God allows into our lives and not accept the bad? And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Again, Job passes the test. He rejects the suggestion that he should curse God and chooses to trust him instead. We gladly receive all the good that God brings into our lives, don't we? We love it. Shouldn't we also trust him when he allows adversity? And again, we see what Job is made of here, don't we? Adversity shows us who we really are. It reveals whether our worship is real. And here in chapters 2, we see it reveals whether our trust is genuine. We say we trust God, but we won't really know for sure until we're tested. It's easy to trust God when everything's going great, but trust is proven genuine when some tragedy strikes, and I trust him still. On May 17 of 2008, Christian recording artist Stephen Curtis Chapman and his family suffered a terrible, devastating loss when their 5-year-old adopted daughter, Maria, was struck and killed as Chapman's 17-year-old son was backing his SUV out of the family's driveway. After much prayer and counsel, Chapman returned to his tour promoting his newest album. And a freelance reporter by the name of Elizabeth Diffin was present on the occasion, and she wrote about the experience. And here's what she said. It's not often you leave a concert reflecting on the words of a song by a different artist. But as I exited the July 24, 2008 Stephen Curtis Chapman event, the words of a Matt Redman song echoed through my head. Chapman opened the concert with Redman's "Blessed Be Your Name." Just 2 months after the death of his 5-year-old daughter, Maria Sue, in a tragic accident at the family's home. "Blessed Be Your Name" was also the first song Chapman sang that day of Maria's death, when he wasn't sure he'd ever be able to sing again. Inspired by the story of Job, at one point the lyrics repeat, "He gives and takes away." Chapman explained to the audience of nearly 5,000, as I sang this song that day, it wasn't a song, it was a cry, a scream, a prayer. I found an amazing comfort and peace that surpasses all understanding. Maria's death caused Chapman to re-examine the words of many of his songs to see if he could still sing them. And instead of, deciding he couldn't sing those words anymore, the experience brought the meaning of some of those songs into sharper focus. And one of those songs was was Chapman's song entitled Yours, which addresses how everything in the world belongs to God. And Chapman said, in this song in particular, I had come to a new realization that there's not an inch of creation that God doesn't look at and say, all that's mine. And as a result, Chapman added a verse to that song. The words go like this: I've walked the valley of death's shadow, so deep and dark that I could barely breathe. I've had to let go of more than I could bear, and I've questioned everything that I believe. Still, even here in this great darkness, a comfort and hope comes breaking through as I can say in life or death, God, we belong to you. Adversity reveals who we really are. It reveals whether our worship is real. It reveals whether our trust is genuine. And the question is, when adversity comes into your life, will you pass the test? It might be that someone's sitting there thinking, no, something like that happened to me, I'd curse God. And what you're talking about is crazy talk. I don't know why anyone would worship and trust a God who lets bad things happen like that. Well, here's the piece that you might be missing. We believe in a God who is able to bring unimaginable good from the most horrendous evil. It's called the gospel. The most horrendous evil is that we were all destined to judgment. We were destined to condemnation because we had rebelled against God, the God who loved us. We had sinned, and our sin created this huge gulf between us and God that we couldn't cross. It put us in debt to God in such a way that we could never repay that debt. And yet the truth of the gospel is that God loved us so much, he didn't want to leave us in that condition. And so he did for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. He found a way for that debt to be paid. He found a way for that gulf to be crossed. And he sent his eternal son, Jesus, whose life was of infinite worth, to come into this world, to be born a baby, to become one of us so he could represent humanity. And all Jesus ever did in his life was love people and care for people and teach them the truth about God. And yet he was hated and despised and rejected by men. And some found a way to have him nailed to a cross, to die a death he didn't deserve, to suffer one of the most hideous deaths that one could possibly suffer. The eternal Son of God, sinless, life of infinite worth, hanging on the cross, paying for your sin and mine. He died, he was buried. Satan thought he'd won a great victory. But God always has the last word. On the third day, he was raised from the dead, triumphant over sin and death, breaking sin's grip and taking away the punishment that should be ours, if only we'll put our faith and trust in him. You see, a God who would be willing to go to that extent, to allow his son to suffer all that for us, do you think we can ever really doubt his love? We believe in a God who can bring the dead back to life. We believe in a God who will bring the wicked to justice and vindicate his children who are made to suffer. We believe in a God who will one day make all things new, set all things right, and wipe away every tear. And if you'd like to know more about how you can have a relationship with that God, then I'm going to invite you to come see me after the service. I've got a booklet I'd like to give you. It's called Saying Yes to a Relationship with Jesus. And if you don't make it here to the front to see me, just come up and say, I'd like a copy of that booklet. Or on your way out, you'll see it on the blue table to the right of the doors. You'll see a supply of these as well. Feel free to pick one up. Because Jesus is the ultimate proof of God's unfailing love for us. And when life throws its worst at us, he is the reason so many of us here today can say, blessed. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Let's stand and sing.